Okay, welcome to Chapter 4, Section 2. This should be really quick. There's only a couple of slides here for us to go through. And this is just a little more information on federalism, just to give a little more detail to it. And when states do business with each other, there are some guidelines as to how it's supposed to work. And this stuff's all written into the Constitution, U.S. Constitution. Again, the states themselves can't set these rules. However, when the Constitution doesn't deal with it and there's nothing written, then the states have to go and figure something out for themselves. Okay, so we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, so first concept is something called full faith and credit. And the idea is if you have records generated in one state, then other states have to take those records too. So I remember this when I was, in the military. I had a California driver's license, and then we moved out to Hawaii. I get to use that California's driver's license, and if I were going to live in Hawaii, they would probably make me turn in my California license and get a get a Hawaii license. But no, because I was in the military, they let me keep my California license. Now, when I moved to Virginia, because I had left the military, at that point, they said, all right, turn in your California driver's license and get a Virginia driver's license. And then when I moved back to California, I had to turn in my Virginia license and they then handed me a California driver's license. I haven't had a driver's test since I was 16 years old. And so that's the beauty of full faith and credit, that the fact that California certified me to drive is what made me able to drive in Virginia. And again, that's the same thing. If you're driving and you have your license, you can drive into Arizona. You don't have to go get a new license just to be able to drive into Arizona. Now, when I got married, we got married here in California, and so that I did not need to transfer that marriage license into whatever state I was moving. So as we've moved around, we've just retained. We got married in California. Well, I was able to maintain our marriage license wherever we went, and so that's the beauty of the system. Is it allows easier, more efficient movement between states, and that's important, particularly for our economy. If job openings happen in another state, and it's very difficult for people to move because of records and things like that, people won't move, and that becomes a situation that we talked about in economics called resource immobility. That if resources can't move, then you'll get a place where you have all these workers in one place out of work, and you got all these jobs in another place where people can't move. And so it's just that the system just doesn't work, and that leads to less wealth creation. Next concept is something called privileges and immunities, and the basic law is whatever law you have in your state, that law applies to everybody in the state, whether they're a resident of that state or somebody just visiting. So they can't put up a sign that says, all right, for California drivers, the speed limit is 80 miles an hour, and if you're from North Dakota, you have to drive 25 miles an hour. No, that's the idea, is those laws need to apply equally. Now, when you go to another state, you are subject to the laws of that state. Okay, so that's an important thing to understand when you go into that state. So they just have to keep it the same within their state. Next concept is something called extradition. And typically where a crime is committed determines where the case is going to be heard. If it's a federal law that has been broken, you'll have to go to the nearest federal court. That might be in a whole other state. That's not what this is about. If a state law is broken, let's say a speeding ticket or whatever, typically, if there's been an accident or something like that, then we actually have to have a trial for that. And the person lives across state lines, if the trial is going to be held where the crime was committed for the most part, unless there's issues where it may be difficult to get a good, fair trial. Sometimes you get those weird situations where something's really popular. They'll move it just for that situation. But the case usually is going to happen where the crime happens. And so if you do a crime in California and you flee to Arizona, Arizona is going to extradite, and that's this phrase here, extradition. It's the process of returning a criminal to the state where the crime was committed to face trial. Now, we have what are called extradition treaties with other countries. This is all about how states deal with each other, okay? Meaning California, Hawaii, Arizona, all that kind of stuff. This is just side stuff, not having to do with tests. But we do have treaties with some countries that if you flee to a state where we have a treaty, or another country where we have a treaty, then we can ask that country to send that person back to us for trial, and that happens all the time. Another concept is something called interstate compacts, and that's usually when we're dealing with a common resource that needs to be shared. One of the most important is water. Let's say you have when we think of the Colorado River sort of snaking through, Colorado and New Mexico uses that water, Arizona, California, and that water has to be divvied out to those states. And so they'll actually come to an agreement as to what percentage each state gets. Because if you're downstream and the upstream states use the river, there's no water left for the downstream state. And so an interstate compact is an agreement to get that all done. There are ways, again, states choose to tax, and they choose to give services. One way to increase services in a state, even is to have federal money come to the states. And so, again, the purpose of this is to, hopefully get a little bit of evening out where states where there's wealth, they can actually go to where money is needed, and specifically where in the state it's needed. And so you get certain standards for roads and bridges and schools and things like that. And Monte Vista, our school, we get a lot of federal government money that rolls to us, and because of that money, there are certain things we have to do to be in compliance to be able to keep that money, and that's minimum standards. When we think of our standards that we have for our educational and all of that, a lot of that is to force us to do certain things that are for your benefit as a student, so that the money's well spent and we get a good, well educated population, for our country. One of the issues is something called efficiency. The bigger the government agency, the more money is usually wasted. Or the bigger the scope of the government, meaning the more people that government is taking care of, or a part of, or representing, the more waste. And so typically states tend to be more efficient in their money. So even though the money may be raised at a federal level, federal taxes, and then the federal government literally hands that money over to the states can then use that money in a way that's more efficient than if we had a federal government run it.